Hi, I'm Keith Baker, and today I'll be talking about achievement goal orientation and how a learning orientation will help with the feedback process. This first study relates to doctors in Europe. These residents were given an instrument to find out their dominant goal orientation, in particular whether they were strongly performance-oriented, over here, or strongly learning-oriented, shown over here. And what they found was that for doctors who were strongly performance-oriented, they found the process of receiving feedback to be particularly costly. That's this box down here. The positive sign means that there was a positive association with being performance-oriented and having a view that feedback is costly or risky business. In contrast, our residents who were strongly learning-oriented saw benefits to the process of feedback. That's the positive sign here. In other words, learning-oriented physicians in training saw the process of feedback as a positive thing. It was a good thing. It was beneficial and helpful. Those residents who saw benefits to feedback did not, and that's the minus sign right here, did not see the feedback process as risky. Rather, they saw it as beneficial. This flows directly from the goals that people have when they have a learning orientation versus a performance or validation orientation. Learning-oriented people want to use feedback to improve, so it harmonizes with their goal of wanting to improve. Feedback, particularly critical, or feedback looking at how you could be better, is consistent with the goals of the learning orientation, which is improving competence or performance. In contrast, validation or performance orientation really is about having a goal of looking good in the eyes of others and at all costs not looking bad in the eyes of others. And so, in this case, feedback, particularly critical feedback, is particularly in conflict with the goals of the individual. Feedback seeking is an extension of this process. What I've schematized here is an individual, and they can seek positive feedback about another person, which is to say something such as, "How did you do that so well? I'd like to learn from you." Or, "I'd like to be able to do what you do. How did you do that?" In contrast, you could seek negative feedback about somebody else. In other words, you might ask, "How did they make a mistake? What did they do wrong?" You can also seek feedback about oneself. You can seek positive feedback about yourself, things like, "Can you tell me what my strengths are? What am I doing well?" Conversely, you can seek negative or critical feedback about yourself, such as, "What is an area for me to improve on? What do I need to work on? Is there a particular weak area I should focus on? Or how could I do this task better?" In this study, they determined the individual's goal orientation by using validated instruments, and for individuals who were strongly learning-oriented, those people tended to seek positive feedback in others. In other words, they wanted to know how others did well or what they did correctly. And conversely, strongly learning-oriented individuals wanted to know what they could improve on, what their weaknesses were so they could focus on them and improve them. So that's the negative feedback they would seek about themselves. In contrast, those who are dominantly performance-oriented had quite the opposite pattern of feedback seeking. In particular, they would seek negative feedback about other people, asking how they did poorly, what sort of things were they doing wrong. And conversely, they would specifically ask for positive feedback about the self. "Can you tell me my strengths? What am I doing well?" And so on, so forth. The important thing here is that these patterns actually influence how people did at their jobs. Seeking negative feedback about the self, looking for areas to improve or focus on for improvement, is associated with positive job performance. Similarly, seeking positive feedback about other people, what they did well, what their strengths were, was also associated positively with job performance. In contrast, seeking positive feedback about oneself, asking for one's strengths and things they're doing well, is negatively associated with job performance. Perceptions of fairness are particularly important when it comes to performance evaluations of individuals, whether it's in a scholastic environment or in a job performance situation. Performance evaluations, in order for them to be useful, need to be trusted and need to be seen as fair. In this study, they looked at two types of fairness. One is called procedural fairness, and that has to do with whether or not the individual thought the evaluations were accurate, had low bias, and were ethically conducted. In this case, the performance evaluations were given under two circumstances. One with a framework of a temporal framework, which is how an individual did over time compared to themselves, which is a learning-oriented approach. Or they were randomized to be given social feedback, which is to say how this individual did compared to others in the organization, and that's a performance-oriented framework. And what I point out here, on the y-axis, we have the perception of fairness of the procedural type. And you can see here that when performance evaluations were given to individuals with a temporal framework or learning-oriented framework, they had a higher procedural perception of fairness, which is much more likely to yield an acceptance of that evaluation. They also studied interpersonal fairness of these performance evaluations. In this case, interpersonal fairness means that you perceive the performance evaluations and that the process was carried out with dignity, respect, and politeness towards you. Again, individuals were randomized to receive their performance evaluations with a temporal framework, which is learning-oriented in nature, or, again, this concept of a social framework where you compare the individual's performance to other people in the organization, and that's driving a performance-oriented framework. You can see here, again, on the y-axis is the perception of fairness of the interpersonal fairness type, and you can see those who were given their performance evaluations in a learning-oriented or temporal framework had higher degrees of interpersonal fairness. So again, this is much more likely to yield acceptance of the performance evaluation by the individual. Thanks for spending some time on the Expert Pathway.